It was February 14, 1943, at an altitude of 18,000 feet over Bougainville, high above the Solomon Islands. Here, Japan's naval aviation would have its first taste of a new reality, delivered by a fighter plane that was destined to methodically tear apart the aerial dominance they had commanded across the Pacific. An American fighter, painted a deep, dark blue, appeared on the scene. Its uniquely bent wings, shaped like a gull's in reverse, made it instantly recognizable, even from miles away. The aircraft suddenly rocketed straight up in a vertical climb, a maneuver that shattered every principle of air combat the Japanese pilots had ever known. It blew past 20,000 feet, then soared beyond 22,000, climbing effortlessly with power to spare. All the while, the legendary Mitsubishi Zero, the very symbol of the Imperial Japanese Navy's might, was gasping for air at its performance limit, struggling just to hold altitude. This was the combat debut of the Vought F4U Corsair, an aircraft that would soon earn the fearsome nickname Whistling Death. The name came from the eerie shriek created by its wing root oil coolers as it plunged from the sky. In less than 18 months, this one fighter design alone would completely break the fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Services. Most seasoned aviators, through one crushing display after another of its sheer technological advantage, it invalidated every combat strategy that Japanese pilots had spent years honing since 1937. What transpired on that Valentine's Day was far more than just another dogfight. It signaled the dawn of a new era of systematic technological supremacy, one that would forever change the role of Japan's most skilled pilots. They went from being predators to prey, from self-assured masters of the sky, to men who would consciously break off an attack the moment they recognized those distinct, bent wings on the horizon. To truly grasp the mental wreckage the Corsair left in its wake, one has to first appreciate the unwavering self-belief held by these Japanese naval pilots. In early 1943, these men were the hardened survivors of what was arguably the planet's most punishing aviation training regimen on Earth. The Outrun, or Naval Aviator Preparatory Course, took in fewer than 2% of all who applied. Those chosen faced a grueling 3-year curriculum, a process so harsh that a shocking number of candidates died during training, more than what American forces had lost in entire battles. Back in 1943, the typical Japanese carrier aviator had logged well over 800 hours of flight time, with many seasoned pilots from the China campaign boasting more than 2,000 hours. These were the airmen who had completely rewritten the rules of naval combat at Pearl Harbor, dealt a stunning blow to the British at Ceylon, and maintained absolute air superiority from Burma to the Gilbert Islands. In 1942, the Mitsubishi A6M0 was racking up an astounding 12-to-1 kill ratio over Allied aircraft. Japanese aviators had perfected energy fighting tactics that leveraged their aircraft's inherent advantages. Its agility was simply unparalleled, combined with incredible range and a superb view from the cockpit. A Zero could outturn any fighter the Allies could put in the sky, and it could fly far longer than any of its adversaries. And in the hands of a master, it was a seemingly invincible machine. The Imperial Japanese Navy's aerial doctrine, honed over 6 long years of combat in China, placed a premium on individual pilot skill and aggressive maneuvering. Their airmen were taught that their spiritual fortitude, the warrior's code of Bushido, was enough to conquer any material disadvantage. And this philosophy had consistently been proven correct against Chinese pilots and against British Hurricanes, as well as against American P-40s and F-4F Wildcats. Every successful dogfight reinforced their core belief that pure skill and warrior spirit would always triumph over technology and armor. Consequently, the Corsair's appearance over the Solomon Islands was at first dismissed as just another American project, attempting to overwhelm the Zero with sheer, brute power. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, VMF-124, delivered the very first dozen F4U Corsairs to Guadalcanal. On February 12, 1943, Japanese recon flights almost instantly spotted the new fighter's highly unusual silhouette. Those signature inverted gull wings, the enormous four-bladed propeller, and the remarkably long nose that stretched far ahead of the cockpit. Their first trial by fire occurred on February 14th, which happened to be Valentine's Day, when a flight of Corsairs provided cover for PB-4Y-1 Liberators during a strike on Kahili Airfield over Bougainville. The resulting confrontation would become infamously known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The first engagements were an absolute catastrophe for the Americans, who lost 9 Allied planes for every 1 Japanese aircraft shot down. But that confrontation taught Japanese aviators a vital lesson. These brand-new American fighters brought a set of capabilities to the table that completely upended the existing dynamics of air-to-air combat. The Corsairs simply refused to play by the old rules of engaging in turning dogfights. Instead, they would soar high above the Zeros, a feat no previous American plane could accomplish. Before plunging down in blistering high-speed attacks, they leveraged their immense speed advantage for a clean getaway, long before the Japanese pilots had a chance to retaliate. After the attack, they would rocket back up to a higher altitude, making them totally invulnerable to being followed. The technical details, which Japanese intelligence slowly managed to gather on the F4U Corsair, painted a picture of a vastly superior machine. Its Pratt Whitney R-2800 double wasp engine generated 2,000 horsepower for takeoff, which could be pushed to 2,250 horsepower using water injection. By comparison, the Zero's Nakajima Sake 21 engine could only muster 1,130 horsepower at takeoff. This was more than just a simple power difference. It signaled the arrival of an entirely new classification of warplane. Altogether, the top speeds of the aircraft highlighted this gap in dramatic fashion. The Corsair was capable of hitting 417 miles per hour at 19,900 feet, while the Zero Model 52, which was Japan's most advanced version in 1943, topped out at just 351 miles per hour. In a dive, this performance gap became absolutely terrifying. Corsairs could regularly blast past 500 miles per hour without losing an ounce of control. Zeros, on the other hand, began to suffer from control surface vibrations at 360 miles per hour and risked catastrophic structural failure beyond 410. The data on their climbing ability was just as disheartening. A Corsair could ascend to 20,000 feet in only 7.7 minutes, maintaining a standard climb rate of 2,890 feet per minute, or an astonishing 3,210 feet per minute when using war emergency power. It took the Zero a grueling 11 minutes to climb to the same height. Once they climbed above 25,000 feet, the tables turned dramatically. In that thin air, the Corsair was in its element, powerful and responsive. The Zero, however, became unwieldy and almost impossible to manage. With a service ceiling of 36,900 feet, the American fighter operated in a realm that might as well have been outer space. To the pilots from Japan, whose own planes struggled to function above 33,000 feet, the disparity in armament had a psychologically crushing effect. The Corsair was equipped with 6 Browning M2.5 0-caliber machine guns, with each one spitting out 850 rounds per minute at a muzzle velocity of 2,840 feet per second. The sheer weight of its firepower amounted to 69 pounds of lead unleashed every second. In comparison, the Zero's 2 7.7mm machine guns, combined with its 2 20mm cannons, could only put out 13 pounds per second. Worse, the cannons held just 60 rounds for each gun, providing only about 7 seconds of total firing time. Japanese pilots quickly learned that the Corsairs were virtually invincible when matched against their own unarmored Zeros. The F4U was built with 155 pounds of armor plating surrounding the cockpit, along with self-sealing fuel tanks and armored oil coolers. Cannon shells that would have vaporized a Zero would simply punch holes in a Corsair, which frequently made it back home riddled with hundreds of punctures. This incredible durability completely reshaped aerial combat. American pilots could fight aggressively, Even with a degree of recklessness, knowing their plane could forgive errors, Japanese pilots had no such luxury. For them, a single miscalculation meant death, as their aircraft, engineered for peak performance by shedding every possible ounce, gave them no protection whatsoever. The Zero's legendary agility was achieved by making it the most lightweight fighter imaginable. It had no armor and no self-sealing tanks. Its very structure was shaved down to the bare minimum. But the Corsair served as proof that American industrial power had found a way to overcome the penalty of weight. They engineered engines with enough horsepower to carry all that armor and still outmaneuver the featherlight fighters that had no protection at all. American engineers built warplanes designed to withstand mistakes, from mechanical failures to lucky enemy hits, a kind of resilience Japanese pilots could only dream of. Rabaul, the formidable Japanese fortress in the Southwest Pacific, was about to become the proving ground for the Corsair's methodical dismantling of Japan's naval air power. It was here, at Japan's most powerful overseas base, that the elite of the Japanese fighter corps was concentrated, in a desperate bid to halt the American advance. By October of 1943, when Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington's VMF 214, the legendary Black Sheep Squadron, arrived with their F4U Corsairs, the entire psychological dynamic had already begun to crumble. Japanese pilots were no longer talking about glorious victory. They were talking about sheer survival. On December 17, 1943, Boyington spearheaded a group of 31 Corsairs, flying escort for a bombing raid on Rabaul. In response, the Japanese scrambled 40 Zeros to intercept them, their finest aviators in their most advanced planes. The Corsairs ascended to a staggering 25,000 feet, an altitude where the nimble Zeros became sluggish and unresponsive. As the Japanese fighters struggled to climb and give chase, the Americans dove straight through their formation, reaching speeds that approached 450 miles per hour. They unleashed quick, devastating volleys and then rocketed away, clawing their way back to the safety of the upper altitudes. The Zeros were left behind, powerless to follow, unable to flee, and unable to draw their enemies into a close-quarters dogfight. The result was 11 Japanese aircraft lost for only 2 Corsairs damaged. The mental dread that the Corsair instilled, however, was something that couldn't be measured in statistics. It went far beyond simple performance metrics. The plane's haunting and unique sound evolved into a weapon all its own. The intakes for the oil cooler, located in the roots of the wings, generated an unforgettably eerie, whistling shriek, especially during high-speed dives, and Japanese pilots would later confess to hearing that sound even in their sleep, causing them to develop gut-level reactions of fear whenever they heard any noise that was even slightly similar. The very look of the Corsair magnified this growing terror. Its distinctive inverted gull wings cast a predatory shadow, a profile that was unlike any other plane in the sky. Then there was the enormous propeller, measuring 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter, which was the largest ever mounted on a fighter aircraft. Its design projected a brutal sense of purpose, and its deep blue color scheme allowed it to blend seamlessly with the ocean below. American aviators intentionally capitalized on this to wage a campaign of psychological terror. They'd perform harrowing dives without shooting a single bullet, purely to generate that distinctive whistling howl, directly over enemy airfields in Japan. Taking it a step further, Boyington's Black Sheep Squadron famously painted menacing shark mouths onto their Corsairs, cementing the aircraft's predatory reputation. By mid-1943, Japan was facing a grim and unavoidable equation. Advanced American fighters like the Corsair were eliminating their experienced aviators at a rate that far outpaced Japan's ability to train new ones. In the pre-war era, Japanese naval pilots would undergo between 500 and 700 hours of flight instruction before ever seeing combat, but by 1943, dire fuel shortages and heavy losses of training aircraft had slashed that time to only 150 hours. By 1945, rookie pilots were arriving with as few as 40 to 60 hours in the cockpit. giving them barely enough skill to manage their own planes, much less survive a dogfight with a Corsair. The psychological burden on the veteran pilots was crushing, as they were teamed up with novices who were utterly outmatched by the American planes. They were helpless to do anything but watch them get shot down. This caused the time-honored system of mentorship to buckle, crumbling under the pressure of unrelenting losses. Veterans who survived encounters with Corsairs in 1943 made a prediction, one that would prove to be horribly correct, about what would unfold once American carrier fleets fully unleashed their new generation of fighter aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the proving ground. There, the F-6F Hellcats, which boasted the Corsair's engine and comparable capabilities, validated that terrifying prophecy in what became known to the Americans as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Somewhere around 400 to 450 Japanese aircraft were obliterated, against a loss of just 130 American planes. A vast number of the Japanese pilots never even saw what hit them, shot out of the sky by enemy fighters they couldn't possibly outclimb, could neither catch them nor escape them in a dive. First-hand accounts from pilots who squared off against the Corsair paint a vivid picture of the psychological toll it took, transforming initial confidence into outright terror. Take First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh of VMF 124, who on May 13, 1943, became the very first Corsair ace. He often recounted how these encounters typically unfolded, with Japanese pilots finding themselves completely outmatched by the Corsair's sheer performance superiority. Walsh managed to score 21 victories in Corsairs within just 6 months. Later on, remarking that the Corsair made aerial combat feel completely one-sided because of its staggering edge and speed, climb rate, and dive capability, as well as its armor and firepower. He observed that dogfighting Zeros became almost a mechanical process. You just had to climb above them and slice through their formation at speeds they could never hope to match. Fire a quick burst, then zoom, climb back to safety, and repeat the process. The astonishing record of Lieutenant Robert Hansen, 20 Japanese aircraft shot down in only 17 days, between January 14th and 30th of 1944, truly highlighted the Corsair's dominance. Flying with VMF 215, Hansen was so masterful at leveraging the Corsair's strengths that Japanese formations would frequently break apart and flee the moment they identified Corsairs heading their way. As 1943 turned into 1944, upgraded variants of the Corsair only served to stretch that performance gap even wider. The F4U introduced a new bubble canopy for vastly improved visibility, along with water injection for a surge of combat power and better quality armor. The F4U could haul 4,000 pounds of bombs, a payload greater than many Japanese bombers could manage, while still easily outflying any fighter Japan could put in the air. Japan's attempts to develop a counter to the Corsair only underscored their technological desperation. Their Zero Model 52 received added armor and self-sealing tanks, but the extra weight was so significant that it sacrificed its crucial maneuverability advantage, without any real improvement in its ability to take damage. While the new Kawanishi N1K George fighter did show potential, its engines, however, were notoriously undependable, and its intricate hydraulic systems were in a constant state of failure. When the F4U Night fighter models appeared in 1944, they introduced an entirely new level of fear. Outfitted with the APS-4 airborne radar system, these 36 heavily modified Corsairs stalked Japanese planes under the cover of darkness, a domain that had previously been Japan's only safe haven. The mental strain of being stalked in the pitch black by a foe you could not see completely destroyed what little remained of Japanese aviator morale. The final blow to their psyche arrived when kamikaze strategies were officially adopted. Near the end of 1944, this shift from warriors fighting for a win to pilots who were only seeking a worthy end signaled a total admission that they were technologically outmatched. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who created the kamikaze initiative, would later confess the real motive behind the suicide missions. Engaging in traditional dogfights with Corsairs and Hellcats was simply no longer a viable option. By the end of 1944, the kill ratio had soared to 15-1, overwhelmingly favoring the American aircraft. Instead of facing a pointless death in a losing battle, Japanese airmen were instructed to try and make their deaths count by targeting naval vessels. American aviators at the controls of Corsairs started racking up kills at a pace that would have been unimaginable. Back in 1942, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boynton claimed 22 of his 26 total kills flying the Corsair, accomplishing this in just 84 days. These high numbers weren't just the result of better piloting, but were fueled by a massive technological superiority. This was a fact the Japanese couldn't ignore. Even their most seasoned flyers knew that American aces owed their success to their superior planes, and not purely to their own abilities. The hardware had grown more critical than the person flying it, which was a fundamental betrayal of Japanese combat philosophy. The Corsair was the embodiment of America's industrial power, distilled into its most potent and deadly form. During the war, Vought's factories rolled out 12,571 Corsairs. This figure alone surpassed the entire fighter aircraft output of Japan, all between 1942 and 1945. Each airframe was a marvel of resources, composed of 13,000 pounds of aluminum, 1,000 pounds of steel, and 18 miles of intricate electrical wiring. Inside the cockpit were 2,000 separate instruments and controls. The Pratt Whitney R-2800 engine, by itself, served as a testament to American industrial dominance. It was a powerhouse with 2,800 cubic inches of displacement, featuring 18 cylinders in a dual-row, supercharged configuration. The entire assembly was built with a level of precision engineering and manufacturing tolerances that Japanese industry could not hope to match. This represented a technological leap so significant that it was far beyond Japan's capacity to reverse engineer, even if they managed to capture an intact model. Meanwhile, Japan was desperately depleting its reserves of manpower, forced to send teenagers with the bare minimum of training into combat against these superior machines. In stark contrast, America produced its pilots with industrial-scale efficiency. Throughout the war, the U.S. Navy successfully trained 60,000 pilots. Every single one of them received 600 hours of comprehensive flight instruction, which included 200 hours at the controls of advanced fighter aircraft. Consequently, American pilots arrived in the Pacific Theater, having already fired more rounds in training exercises than the majority of Japanese pilots would in their entire combat careers. Their preparation involved meticulously studying gun camera footage, analyzing after-action reports from the front lines, and benefiting from a doctrine of continuous tactical refinement. The Japanese pilot training system, on the other hand, had disintegrated into a futile and desperate effort. Freshly assigned pilots were arriving at their squadrons with fewer than 100 total hours in the air. Most had never fired their weapons during training, had no practice with high-altitude flight, and had never executed the high-speed dives essential for combat. The Corsair's evolution into a formidable fighter bomber in 1944 unleashed yet another dimension of fear. Outfitted with bombs, rockets, and napalm, these aircraft could annihilate enemy airfields, devastate shipping, and destroy vital infrastructure with near-total impunity. This newfound multi-role flexibility meant that Corsairs could materialize virtually anywhere, at any moment, fulfilling any combat role required. This layered a crippling strategic uncertainty on top of the already overwhelming tactical terror. Saburo Sakai, with 64 victories, Japan's most renowned surviving ace, offered a stark analysis of what it was like to face the Corsair. In his memoirs written after the war, he confessed that the moment he truly knew the war was lost was when he first encountered the powerful American fighter. It wasn't the threat of a single aircraft that shook him, but the sobering realization that America could produce such a machine in the thousands, while Japan's industry was struggling just to keep its existing planes flying. Sakai bluntly stated that the only way to survive against a Corsair was to refuse the fight altogether. The moment Japanese pilots spotted those distinctive bent wings on the horizon, they would immediately dive toward the ground or race for cloud cover, anything to avoid a direct confrontation. This was not a failure of nerve, but a grim acknowledgement of the facts. By early 1945, challenging a Corsair in a Zero had become a suicidal act. The official numbers tell a story of sheer annihilation. Corsairs were credited with 2,140 aerial victories, for only 189 of their own lost in combat, yielding an incredible 11.3 to 1 kill ratio. Yet even these brutal statistics don't fully convey the psychological wreckage the Corsair left in its wake. A huge number of Japanese planes simply fled without ever fighting. Countless more were obliterated on the tarmac by raiding Corsairs. Many veteran pilots flat out refused to take off if Corsairs were reported to be operating in the area. The final humiliation was laid bare in the production figures. During 1945 alone, the United States manufactured 7,829 fighters of all models. Japan produced a meager 1,104, most of them inferior to Allied designs from 1942. The Corsair assembly line, on its own, built more fighters than the entire Japanese aviation industry combined. The sheer dominance of the Corsair fractured the very foundations of Japanese warrior culture. The hallowed concept of Yamato Damashii, that legendary Japanese spirit, which was supposed to triumph over any material disadvantage, was proven to be an empty promise in the face of crushing technological superiority. The traditional belief in the paramount importance of an individual warrior's prowess was rendered completely irrelevant when personal skill could no longer compensate for such a vast difference in aircraft performance. It was a reality that even the most decorated Japanese ace had to accept. Even a pristine Zero, kept in perfect condition, stood absolutely no chance against a typical American pilot flying a Corsair. This harsh realization completely shattered the philosophical underpinnings of the entire Japanese military training system. The campaign for Okinawa, which raged from April to June of 1945, served as the Corsair's final showcase of its overwhelming superiority. Flying from escort carriers, Marine and Navy Corsairs also launched from newly secured airfields to establish absolute dominance in the sky above Japan's last major stronghold, outside of its own home islands. The data from the Battle of Okinawa clearly illustrates the sheer scale of this one-sided conflict. Corsairs undertook more than 15,000 combat missions, were credited with over 500 aerial kills, and unleashed thousands of tons of munitions. In contrast, the Japanese airmen, many with fewer than 30 hours of flight experience, were systematically annihilated. The handful who survived told stories of dogfights that lasted only seconds, where they never even managed to line up their sights on the Corsairs that took them down. As Japan braced itself for the invasion of its mainland, the thought of confronting thousands of these aircraft induced a state of strategic paralysis. Japanese military planners estimated that the Americans had the capacity to field over 5,000 Corsairs, operating from a combination of carriers and captured airstrips. Against that overwhelming number, Japan could perhaps gather 2,000 serviceable planes, a collection of mostly outdated models, piloted by individuals with the bare minimum of training. Admiral Sumo Toyota, who was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, later admitted that engaging in conventional air-to-air combat was simply no longer feasible. The only tactic left was to conceal their aircraft and save them for one-way suicide missions. The Corsair had single-handedly made the idea of a traditional dogfight completely irrelevant for Japanese aviation. When the atomic bombings concluded the war in August 1945, they inadvertently saved Japan's air forces from complete and final obliteration. Elaborate plans were already in place for Operation Olympic. The planned assault on Kyushu was set to feature a staggering force of over 2,000 Corsairs, launched from 48 carriers and a dozen captured airfields. The Japanese pilots who managed to survive the war later expressed profound relief that they never faced this final battle, acknowledging it would have been annihilation not a fair fight. In the period immediately following the war, American occupying forces escorted Japan's military leadership on a tour of American aircraft manufacturing facilities. The Vought plant in Connecticut, which was still rolling out Corsairs, starkly illustrated the true scope of America's industrial power. They learned that single American factories were manufacturing more aircraft engines than the entire nation of Japan. Some individual American states had a greater capacity for aluminum production than the whole Japanese empire combined. For the former Japanese naval commanders, witnessing these assembly lines firsthand was the moment. They fully grasped the hopelessness of their situation during the war. They had gone up against an industrial Goliath with what amounted to a pre-industrial capacity. They were sending pilots skilled in individual duels against a relentless wave of mass-produced aircraft that were superior in almost every conceivable way. The final operational record of the Corsair in the Pacific War tells a tale of absolute air supremacy. The combat figures show that of the 12,571 Corsairs built, they secured 2,140 aerial victories, while losing only 189 in air-to-air combat. That calculates to a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. They flew over 64,000 sorties, dropping 15,621 tons of ordnance. The aircraft's performance edge was total. It boasted a speed advantage over the Zero of 66 miles per hour, a climb rate advantage of over 1,000 feet per minute, a diving speed advantage exceeding 140 miles per hour, and an altitude ceiling advantage of 3,900 feet. The firepower it could bring to bear was 530% greater. This massive advantage in destructive power was matched by production disparity. At its peak, Corsair manufacturing reached 418 units per month, while Japan's monthly output of all fighter types was a mere 250. An American pilot received 600 hours of training, whereas a Japanese pilot by 1945 was lucky to get between 40 and 60. In the realm of Japanese aviation, engineers meticulously dismantled captured Corsair aircraft, which served as crucial blueprints after the conflict ended, providing a stark measure of just how profoundly their own nation's technology had lagged. Every single component, from the hydraulic systems to the electronics and advanced metallurgy, and even the manufacturing methods themselves, revealed a level of sophistication Japan had never conceived of. The Corsair's design philosophy echoed throughout every subsequent Japanese aerial creation in the post-war era. The insights gained from analyzing the very aircraft that had once tormented their countrymen in the skies became the bedrock of Japan's aerospace evolution for generations. On the other side, American pilots who flew the Corsair harbored complicated feelings regarding their absolute command of the air. For many, the engagements felt less like battles and more like clinical exterminations, especially by 1945, when they found themselves confronting Japanese teenagers in outdated planes. With the Corsair, aerial warfare was transformed into a cold, industrial procedure. American airmen were not chivalrous knights dueling among the clouds. They were skilled technicians handling a far superior piece of equipment. In stark contrast, the Japanese clung fiercely to their warrior ethos until the very end, only to discover the futility of bringing a sword to a gunfight. The absolute supremacy of the Corsair was a catalyst for profound shifts within Japanese society. Following the war, the total inability of sheer spiritual resolve to overcome American technological prowess played a key role in discrediting the militarist ideology and spurred the nation's embrace of technological advancement. The F4U Corsair delivered a daily and deeply personal lesson to thousands of Japanese citizens, showing them their entire perception of the world was flawed. Human spirit was no match for advanced technology. Sheer willpower could not overcome industrial might, and bravery was rendered meaningless when faced with such overwhelming mechanical power. The story of Japanese airmen challenging the F4U Corsair is a raw tale of technology's decisive role in conflict, a narrative etched in fire and loss. It is a powerful testament to the reality that in modern industrial conflict, the factory floor proved mightier than the warrior's code, and cold engineering outmatched raw courage. The Corsair accomplished more than just downing Japanese planes. It completely dismantled an entire way of war. Every Japanese airman who survived a Corsair encounter brought back the same chilling conclusion that this machine was unbeatable, that there was no way to stop it. These individual moments of defeat began to stack up, forging a collective certainty that grew beyond mere battlefield failure, becoming a shocking revelation for their entire culture. German prisoners of war had come to America, assuming they would see a nation of weakness, but were instead confronted by an awesome industrial force. In the same vein, Japanese airmen had started the war, utterly convinced of their superior skill and training. But they soon found themselves confronting something far more than just a better aircraft. They were facing the focused embodiment of a rival civilization's manufacturing supremacy. The F4U Corsair serves as a lasting monument to one key idea, that in the age of total war, superior technology, when amplified by immense industrial power, is the formula for victory. For the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Corsair acted as judge, jury, and executioner. It ruled their equipment to be insufficient, their battle plans to be obsolete, and their guiding principles to be fatally flawed. The swift descent from a feeling of supremacy to one of terror, from self-assurance to utter desperation, from ingenious tactics to the finality of kamikaze dives, could be tracked by the increasing number of Corsair engagements. Every dogfight with the famous bent-wing fighter tore away another layer of wishful thinking, until only the brutal truth was left. Japan took on an industrial Goliath armed with its warrior ethos, and was utterly and completely vanquished. Today, you can see restored Corsairs flying at air shows across the planet, their signature whistling sound still triggering powerful recollections for those who recognize that noise as the sound of impending doom. Yet for the pilots who fought against them in the skies, the Corsair represented something much deeper. It was an instructor of hard-learned lessons, a machine that shattered fantasies and served as hard proof that in contemporary warfare, the country with superior industrial might will always crush the one with the most courageous soldiers. Japanese aviators were gripped by a profound fear of the F4U Corsair, not because of any lack of courage, but because they were men of sound reason. They grasped that they were up against more than just a better machine. They faced the sheer weight of an entire civilization's industrial power. Their dread was a form of insight, a terrible clarity, born from the realization that every core belief they held was utterly false, and that their own deaths would ultimately just be a testament to their enemy's overwhelming power. In the end, the Corsair accomplished something no amount of propaganda ever could. It instilled a deep-seated fear of flying in Japanese aviators. And within that terror, the seeds were sown for Japan's profound change, its evolution from a military-first empire into a global economic force. This was a metamorphosis paid for with the lives of pilots, who discovered far too late that in a modern conflict, individual bravery becomes irrelevant when faced by an enemy that commands the skies.